Good choice, Josh.
Yeah, that was a good one.
Finally a good choice.
You can get your choosing privileges back now. In full.
Welcome to Screens of the Stone Age, the podcast where scientists review movies about prehistoric people. My name is Josh Lindell. I'm a PhD student studying Neanderthal teeth, and I'm here with...
I'm Kim Plomp. I'm a bioarchaeologist. I study human evolution and health and disease.
And I'm Ross Barnett, a paleogeneticist, mainly looking at Ice Age megafauna.
And today we are reviewing the short film The Ugly Little Boy from, I forgot to check what year this is, 1977?
Yeah, I think so.
It looks much older than 1977, and I think that's because it's actually a Canadian film.
I was just going to say, yes. Only in the last, couple of, 10 years, I'd say, has Canadian stuff not looked like that.
There's a very distinct style that I think everyone from Canada would recognize from, it's almost like a lot like these educational PSA sort of style of things that you would have watched on like a film strip in elementary school or something, which is where I remember them from.
Yeah.
Anyway, this is the shortest movie we've watched because I think it's about 26 minutes long. And it's based on a short story by Isaac Asimov of the same name. But I actually realized when we were talking about it last time, Ross, my confusion was that it was also adapted into a full novel by Robert Silverberg, which is over 200 pages long. So I happen to have a PDF that I downloaded a long time ago of the complete novel. But I also read the short story in preparation for this. So I assume you've read it, Ross?
Yeah, I've read the short story. It's really, really good.
Mm-hmm. According to Wikipedia, it was one of Isaac Asimov's second or third favorite of all of his stories. So it was a very good short story. Mm-hmm. Who wants to summarize the film?
I can do it.
Okay.
I probably won't do as good of a job, but so the opening scene is these guys come and ask this lady to follow them. They don't give her any details of why she's being summoned to some place, and they bring her into the scientific unit where she meets this really arrogant science guy who doesn't have time to tell her any of the details, but she has to do this thing that he's demanding her to do. And then when she finds out what it is, it's that they have used reflection and electricity, something, to go back in time and capture a life form from Pleistocene era, which happened to be a little Neanderthal boy. And then somehow with that reflection and what would they say? Mesons or something? What's that?
Mesons?
Mesons, yeah. The particles, I googled that to see if they're real, and it is. I don't understand what they are, but, so all this science stuff, and then, so essentially what it is that they're using all this electrical energy to keep this, life form in the present era. It reminded me of the Rick and Morty episode where they mess with time and the time god comes and they have to wear the electrical collars in order to stay within their time. So it was kind of like that concept. So the little boy has to stay in these rooms, which is electrified to keep him stable in our time. And the reason why they brought this lady in is that she's a nurse. And out of 5,000 applicants, which really isn't that many, the computer has picked her to be the best one to take care of this little boy because she is a good nurse, never has been late for a shift or has any complaints or anything against her, and she has no family, friends, or emotional ties, which kind of, I think, hits her right in the stomach when she finds out that that's what people are known for. And it kind of, me being single, living here with 4 cats, was kind of like, oh no, it's going to be the same. As long as someone feeds my cats. Anyways, and then, so they say that the little boy is going to be here for 200 days and that he needs someone to take care of him, but not get attached to him. So that's her key, her prime directive is to not get emotionally attached to this little boy. But, of course, spending 200 days with him, with any little toddler, you would get highly attached to him, and she does, and she teaches him how to talk, which she's quite proud of, and the scientist guy doesn't seem to care at all. He's like, well, we knew they could talk. That's not interesting, which is quite sad. And then they decide that they have to send the little boy back early, so 23 days early, because it's using so much electricity to keep him there, and they need that electricity to now bring back an adult from the medieval time, because the adult from the medieval time can talk. And at no point in time is there any indication of what they want to talk to the medieval guy about, or how they would be interested in both bringing back a Neanderthal boy, but then that wasn't interesting enough, and something that an adult medieval man would be able to tell them is somehow what they're getting at. We don't know, but that's essentially it. And so they're about to send back the little boy, and the nurse makes a really good point in that he's going to go back to the same location, but it's obviously been 200 or 173 days or whatever since they took him. So his tribe probably thinks he's dead and has moved on. So this toddler is going to get put back to this place, which could be with his tribe, could be in the middle of nowhere by himself without his tribe. So the nurse is worried that he's going to die. Scientist doesn't care. He just wants his energy for the medieval man. And so the last scene is that as they're about to send the little boy back, she runs into their room and hugs him, and then she goes back with him. So now she's living in the Pleistocene with him to take care of him, which I think any sane person would do. You don't send a toddler just out like that. It was very much on the themes of the evil scientists.
Yeah.
Did I miss anything?
No, I think that was perfect.
It is a very short film.
It is. My favorite part, well, one of my favorite parts was when they were showing her, like, they're, setting up the idea that they could send back the little boy. And so they had to send back a rock that they got from the Pleistocene because it was taking up too much energy to keep this rock here. And the geologist that had been in charge of studying the rock was freaking out, like, no, you can't send it back. That's my life's work. I'm not done with it. No. It was really funny. He had to be dragged out of the room kicking and screaming, and it makes me wonder, what was he learning in 1977 from this rock that he's had for 200 days already? Like, what more could he learn from a rock from the Pleistocene?
It sounds like you're part of the problem, Kim, just not accepting a man's emotional attachment to his rock.
Yes,
I think in the book it's a lot more clearly evident that this is set in some distant future. So it's not actually set in 1977 or in 1958, I think, which is when the book was written. It's clearly supposed to be futuristic, and at least from the book, it's really interesting how good Isaac Asimov was at predicting future technology, because he was describing things that are technology we have, but they're like different words for it. Like it was talking about like a basically a tablet, but he just used some different word for it, things like that. Mm-hmm. But in the book, the guy with the rock, I don't know if it was evident in the film, but he was planning to take it out of stasis, which they explained is very bad because it uses up a huge amount of energy. So the things from the past can only be held in stasis and then released back to the time they came from. And so it almost felt more like a punishment. It's like, you were going to take this out, we are going to send it back now, and your time with it is done,
Right. I mean, yeah, I did have my favorite rocks when I was a kid, but I mean, especially if you have the technology to bring a rock back from the Pleistocene, you're going to have the technology to get whatever data you need from it within an hour.
I mean, the other thing is, I guess, that, all rocks have come from the Pleistocene. It's not...
Yes, I know that too. So really, the only thing that's going to change is the life forms on it, like the bacteria and all that stuff on the rock. That's going to be... It's really different.
Not very much.
And again, that wouldn't take that long at that time with that high-tech technology, they'd be able to just analyze it.
It's a really clever conceit, the idea in the book that they have to be within the stasis field. It sets up a really good kind of conflict, a believable conflict, and a very kind of claustrophobic setting that they have to stay within the stasis field, or else things go incredibly bad. So yeah, I really love the short story. I'm a big fan of Isaac Asimov. He's, it's clear from reading his stuff that he has a very hard science background. I think he was a professor of biochemistry.
Yeah.
In his alternate non-literary life.
Yeah.
And his stories are kind of mostly phenomenally good. And this is one of the best.
was a really good story.
So do we want to stick with the format and start with nitpicking scientific inaccuracies? It's pretty short and there's not that much to work with, but did you guys get anything?
I mean, they portrayed the Neanderthal again as if they were more animalistic than we would be. Like, she put a bowl down of milk or something for it and he licked it up like a cat. And not even that well, so it was ineptly licked up like a cat. Which there's no reason to believe that a Neanderthal child wouldn't reach out and drink the bowl in the same way that we would. Since, although Mysterian bowls are not accurate, I'm sure that he would be able to figure that out and have the dexterity for it. The costume wasn't that bad. They had the brow ridges and stuff. I mean, it made the child looked creepy, but it looked creepy because of that same old thing where they were getting an adult man to dress up as a child, right? And no matter what makeup you have, when you do that, there's always a creepy element because the proportions of the eyes and the mouth, and like, it's just not right for a child, right? So it kind of plays on that instinct that we have that something's not quite right. But other than that, I think the makeup is fine.
I think the actor was I think it was somebody with achondroplasia.
Yes.
But he has the most fantastic name ever for somebody to play a Neanderthal, which is Guy Big. I mean, that is a
Canadian
name.
Actor. Yeah.
It's like Slim Pickens or something.
I'm surprised he wasn't in more, but it was this role and then a TV show that I never watched.
I think from his IMDb, he died the year after.
That's
after
what
this film. It's a shame.
So.
But also, apparently, he was the inspiration for Mini-Me in the Austin Powers series.
Oh, really? I guess Mike Myers is Canadian as well. He probably would have seen this as a young person.
Yeah.
Wow.
The hilarious House of Frightenstein, I think, is the other show that he was in.
Yes. Did you watch it?
Also a good name.
No, I haven't seen it.
I'm guessing it's a Canadian kid show. Yeah, I never saw it. I wasn't allowed to watch too much scary stuff as a kid.
I don't think there's not. I mean, apart from all the kind of sci-fi techno speak, the reversing the polarity of the photon torpedoes style stuff. There's not really much to critique. It's nice that when he turns up, he's got clothes on. So obviously they're showing Neanderthals as clothes makers, which is good.
Warm clothes too.
They don't give him a lot of speech, but they do allow him to speak. I mean, it's very different from the book where he is fully kind of, I think he's a much older child and he learns how to speak English and has a full kind of vocabulary and is able to give vent to his internal thoughts and feelings, which they don't do in the film, probably for reasons. I like that they gave him, they show lots of x-rays. I think one nitpick is that the x-ray they show is clearly not of a Neanderthal. It's despite while they're doing the kind of live x-rays, it's clearly a modern human skull that's being x-rayed.
And an adult.
Not a Neanderthal.
It's an adult too. It's not a toddler.
Yeah. I like that they in the blood test they suggest that he's rhesus negative, which is pretty much what you'd expect probably for a Neanderthal. I know work's been done on the ABO blood group of Neanderthals, and some of them would have been O. But I don't know if anyone's looked at rhesus groups in Neanderthal DNA, but that. Yeah, you'd expect being rhesus negative would be the default. Yeah.
What are rhesus groups?
The rhesus is the positive and negative part of it, right?
Yeah. So rhesus groups are.
Oh, right. Okay. So it's like you're A negative, right?
Yeah, and it's important because if you're female and you're rhesus negative, but your partner is rhesus positive, then for your first baby it's not an issue, but once there's been exposure to the rhesus positive antigen, it's one of the things that can cause, I think it's cyanosis of the newborn or something it's called. It can lead to the mother's immune system attacking the fetus and it being born prematurely and with massive kind of issues. In fact, before the discovery of rhesus factors, it led to a lot of neonatal mortality. And so now, if you are rhesus negative and your partner is rhesus positive, then you get anti-rhesus injections for your second pregnancy to help kind of damp down the immune response, which could cause problems.
Oh wow! Didn't know any of that.
Yeah, so it's one of those things that has led into all sorts of interesting social research, because of course, having to know the blood factor of your partner during your
Blood
pregnancy,
types.
if there's any discrepancy between the partner that's said to be versus the partner that actually is, then that's
Right.
interesting data.
Hmm.
But I don't know any other issues. I mean, it's interesting they didn't show any lithics at all. Almost every other time we've looked at a film with Neanderthals in it, they've managed to shoehorn some lithics in there somewhere.
I guess with a little kid, if he was young enough, probably not.
Yeah, I mean, generally it was pretty good on the kind of Neanderthal stuff, I thought.
Well, except for when they had him having trouble walking, but then at other times running and climbing. And I don't know, they were just trying very hard to make him seem not quite human, which I don't think probably behaviorally there wouldn't be that much difference.
I wasn't sure whether they were trying to make him look like, a kind of sub 1 year child, so that he was actually learning to walk in the same way that human babies learn to walk. But then you're right, they did have him kind of climb up the shelves and throw bottles at people before he could walk, which was,
The movie's pretty true to the story, but there's a few sort of significant differences. And the first is that in the film, they're planning to keep him for 200 days. But in the story, they don't really have an end date for when to send him back. And in the end, they end up keeping him for, I think, 4 years, right?
Ooh.
So that's why he starts out as a 3-year-old, but he learns language and basically grows up and develops within this facility completely.
With Nurse Fellows as his kind of tutor and sort of surrogate parent. And he in the book or in the short story, I haven't read the extended book, but in the short story, he's very much identical to any other kind of human 7-year-old and has the same capabilities and internal monologue that any child has, which makes him, I think, more sympathetic than the little boy in the film, who's not given anything other than Mama, and I think he says Timmy as well, doesn't he? Which is the name he's given.
Mm-hmm.
But that's it. Whereas I think you form a much stronger bond in the short story to Timmy the Neanderthal than you do in the film.
I suppose it would be hard to age the character 4 years in a film when he's already played by an adult man, right?
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting because at first she just called him Boy, right? Boy. And then she gave him the name Timmy kind of right at the end, close to the end. And so to me that was like signifying that she was no longer being detached. Now he was Timmy, not just Boy.
Yeah. I think they go into that kind of aspect in a lot greater detail in the short story. So there's really nice, quite touching scene where Timmy has been taught the word mother, and and because he's older and he can speak, he says to Nurse Bellows that he sometimes, even though he knows she's just a nurse, he sometimes calls her mother inside his head. And was that okay? Which is very touching.
Aww. So if the movie was super sad, the book is just going to break my heart.
Oh, it's so much sadder.
Yeah.
Aww.
But it's also a greater payoff. I mean, definitely, I think in the book, you because of the bond that forms between Edith and Timmy, it feels much more natural that at the end she wants to go back with him. Whereas in the short film, they've only got half an hour, so it's much more rushed and possibly slightly less realistic.
Yeah.
In terms of the bond they formed. But yeah, I think we definitely have to talk about just how 70s this is. I mean, I don't know if it's more because it's Canadian, but I mean, the music, super 70s, fantastic 70s music. The turtlenecks that everyone seems to wear are incredibly 70s. I mean, even the characters, even their kind of proportions, they've all got sizable guts on them, which is fantastically 70s. I loved it. I thought it was great.
The whole set and all the uniforms look like the Starship Enterprise.
Yeah.
It really feels like it's 10 years older than it is, though.
And the sci-fi remote controls, which have like 3 buttons on them, but no wire. I'm sure that was very futuristic at the time.
Oh, it did have a wire. The one that he pressed to turn the orange light on had a huge wire.
like not, but like an antenna, not an actual kind of electric wire.
No, I think it was a wire, but
Was
maybe
it?
I was seeing it wrong.
Why not just have a button then? I mean, ridiculous.
Yeah, that was a little strange. They had this huge glowing red button, and then instead of just pressing the button, they like held a handheld device near it and pressed a button on the device.
And everything, even the doors were kind of remote controlled with buttons. And I love the instructions that the nurse gets, that when she goes into the stasis field, she has to wear a super high-tech stasis belt to stop her like shorting out the circuits and all the rest of it. But it's clearly just like a corrugated Hoover tube with some blinky lights inside that she wears around herself. I love it. I love the optimism of the sci-fi of that time. That, like, you know, even the kind of knowledge about how unsophisticated the viewers were, that they could watch it at that time and say, "Oh my God, this could even be the year 2000. It's so far advanced and in the future." And like Josh was saying, all the small touches, like the kind of Starship Enterprise desks. But what I loved as well was the font. When he pulls up Nurse Fellow's record on his high-tech computer, the font is fantastically 70s futuristic. That kind of, like an LED kind of clock screen, but slightly rounder and just, perfect.
Yeah, and the noise that it makes when it goes on and off, or whatever. It was so good. I liked how the science guy was just always so busy. He never had time to talk to her, answer her questions, or listen to her about everything. He was always so busy. Every time she walked up to him, he was like shuffling folders and papers and looking at Polaroids and moving one folder from one place to another, and he was just too busy to talk to her.
Or storming from one concrete building to another. I mean, even the architecture that we saw from the outside was incredibly kind of 70s concrete brutalism. Fantastic.
Yeah. I know, I even looked to see if it was filmed at Simon Fraser University, because that's what the university looks like.
And was it?
No, Toronto.
Oh, well.
So it's just Canadian 70s.
Yeah, Canadian 70s is a style.
Yeah.
So I think probably the biggest actual problem with this whole concept would be the ethics, right?
Yeah.
The whole idea of bringing a child through time to study it, I think the conceit is that they don't consider it to be a human. But even if you were doing this with, an animal like an ape or a monkey or, something that the public would have emotions about, it just would not be possible to do. I think the book goes into a lot more effort to explain why they chose this Neanderthal child, or maybe didn't even necessarily choose a child specifically. But yeah, even the whole concept of bringing any kind of human, like they want to get a medieval peasant, which is their main goal, the idea of against somebody's will, because the individual has no idea they're going to be traveling through time. It's different from going back in time and studying people, but to bring someone against their will into the future just to talk to them.
It's kidnapping, essentially, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Well, they said when they brought the little boy, they said that the reason why there was like dirt and rocks and grass all around them is because they had to make sure that the field was larger than the child, because they didn't want to accidentally only bring it back half his leg or half his head or something.
Mm-hmm.
So there's obviously like a volume that they've chosen. So they must have known that there was a child sitting in that exact location, because if it was an adult, then it would have just been cut in half. Or if they're just doing like cherry picking, just trying locations, and you're just going to end up with like a foot here and bear's head here and half a tree there. So they must be able to know where, like, what it is and where.
Yeah, I think in the story they talk about kind of getting locks on to particular individuals, and I can't remember if it's in this story or in other ones. I might be getting confused, but I thought that the way they chose it was somebody that they knew was going to die pretty shortly after they were picked up. So they're essentially kind of taking them out of a timeline where they were going to die, like in the next 5 minutes. I think I might be getting that confused with another story, but that would be one explanation for the kind of ethics of taking them back. But you're right. I mean, it is essentially kidnapping someone, and they know from the conversation they have between Dr. Hoskins and Nurse Fellows, that these are talking sentient humans. I mean, they can try and claim they're not humans, but if they know that they can talk and speak and think, then they're humans by my understanding.
And make and wear clothes and yeah.
I don't think they said that in this story because I don't remember that, but that would be a good explanation for how to choose who you choose. Because if you have, sight through time, you could choose someone right before they die, and then you'd have a sort of minimal influence on the timeline.
I may be getting it confused with, I think it's a Ray Bradbury short story where they go back in time and then accidentally step on a butterfly. I think that's maybe the one I'm getting confused with. That's
a good segue because they don't really talk about it in the film, but in the book they do mention altering the timeline and how they get around that. And he sort of hand waves it away saying, basically, we've worked out if the thing we take from the past is not very important, then the timeline sort of, averages out and goes back to normal over time. So you can take a Neanderthal child and a child is not very important. But if you take, a king, then obviously that's going to have huge ripple effects and change the timeline.
But how do you know what's important?
Well, yeah, it's very interesting that within 5 years, we have the sort of the emergence of chaos theory, which figures out that is exactly the opposite of what would happen, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And how do you define importance as well?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's the sort of the archaeological perspective, I think, where, people are always interested in the important people, but there's nobody who is really not important. You know, in a generational perspective, one individual has so many children, and then each of those children has so many. So at a certain point, if you kill one person, then it could be millions of descendants alive today that wouldn't exist, and it could be just some average person. You have no way to predict who is a descendant of that average person.
Unless you can see through time.
It could even be different than that, where you take out a person and they may not have any descendants, but they might have been the person that spread cholera from one place to another and started, the spread.
Or invented the wheel.
Or invented the wheel. Or stopped the spread of an infection somehow. They could have been that barrier, and then you have it's probably just pandemic thinking, but
a nice message from extrapolated from the story that everyone is important and everyone has a part to play. I like that. You
don't know what role you're playing.
No.
I think I read somewhere actually that there was an original ending to the first draft of the story that was changed, where it turns out that this Neanderthal boy would grow up to be the person who discovered fire. And so by removing him from the timeline, all of civilization didn't evolve the way it did. And so by taking him out, they destroy themselves.
But then that's great, because then you get instantly into the grandfather paradox. So if they take out the Neanderthal that discovers how to tame fire, and then all of civilization collapses, then how do they invent time machines to go back in time and get the Neanderthal?
That really is the problem with all time travel movies, because I love the concept, but it's so hard to find any movie that does it remotely well at all.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I think this short story and the film does attempt to kind of get around that by, the idea that they're taking people from the past into the present and, identifying unimportant people that can be removed without affecting things. So at least an attempt was made.
Yeah, but I for a while in my undergrad, I was really interested in chaos theories, so I'm going to take an aside and talk about it a little bit anyway, because it was only like 3 years after this short story was written where Isaac Asimov hand waves this away and says, if you don't take somebody important, then the timeline averages itself out after a little while and it goes back to normal. But this is obviously the opposite of what we know as the butterfly effect, which was created, or it was identified, I guess, by Edward Lorenz, who was in 1961 using a very advanced for the time computer, which was a very simple computer today, to model weather, to predict weather for forecasting. And so basically he was modeling weather patterns using, I think, like 12 different variables, like wind speed and temperature and things like that. And basically, he would plug in the data, and then the computer would run a simulation, right? And it would probably take a long time because it was 1961, and the computer was probably the size of a room. But he wanted to come back to this later and rerun it, but he didn't want to have to start from the beginning again, so the computer had a printout where he took the values from like halfway through from the previous day, and he's like, I'm going to start it in the middle and then keep it running after that. And because it's a computer model, if you take the values from the middle and you plug them in as your starting values, it should run identical and then continue going, right? But what he discovered was when he ran it with exactly the same numbers, the model ended up becoming completely different. It started out the same, but then gradually started changing, and then the weather patterns that he was modeling ended up completely different from the ones he did the day before. And he realized it was because the computer printout rounded off the values to 3 decimal places instead of 6, which is what the computer was actually running on. And those small values were supposed to be like equivalent to the amount of wind created by a butterfly flapping its wings, which is where the butterfly effect name comes from. So basically what he said was, if you have extremely small changes in the starting conditions, small enough to be like a butterfly flapping its wings, you could dramatically change the way the weather played out over time. And that's where the term butterfly effect comes from. The idea is if a butterfly flaps its wings in Brazil, then you get a tornado in Texas, I think is the example that they gave. And so in terms of time travel, we can see that it doesn't matter how important you are, no matter how small the effect is, the effects don't average out over time, they compound over time. So even if you took a single atom out of the past, that would have some kind of effect which would not go away. It would get worse and worse and worse, and you'd end up with huge changes thousands of years later rather than the changes averaging out, which I always find really interesting. Everybody knows about the butterfly effect, but I don't know if people understand how literally it is related to like the effect of a butterfly flapping its wings. Like it's literally that size of an effect that can cause dramatic changes in weather if you change those. If you had a computer simulation where you were able to actually change those or control for those, that level of detail, which is why it's so hard to predict the weather, right?
Long term, anyway.
Well, I didn't know that story. Thanks for explaining that.
I don't know, the weather in Winnipeg has been so unpredictable this year. Is the weather crazy where you guys are too?
Yeah, we've had, obviously not in Inverness, but in the UK we've had,
right, you're in the UK.
Yeah. Hitting 40 degrees for the first time ever in parts of the south of England.
That's not
crazy.
Good. In Manila, as far as I know, I've been told that wet season started early this year, but other than that, I have no idea if this is normal or not normal. But in the Okanagan, where I grew up, it's getting super hot again. Last year was terrible. Forest fires. You couldn't even breathe outside for the smoke. So we're probably heading to similar. It's heartbreaking.
Well, to think that that's all because somebody didn't kidnap a Neanderthal child 40,000 years ago, and then it invented fire, and it led to the Industrial Revolution, and then destroyed the entire Earth.
Or it's that they did kidnap it, and then it's just like Area 51 style.
That Neanderthal child was going to grow up to be the Neanderthal that murdered the Neanderthal that would have invented fire. Another difference between the film and the short story is that in the story, the facility that they keep the Neanderthal in is modeled like an apartment, whereas in the film, it looks like a science lab, like it has shelves full of mysterious chemical beakers that the child can throw around the room. But in the short story, it was made just to look like a regular apartment with a bathroom and a bed and just to be like a normal place for the child to grow up in. Because, of course, they kept him there for many years instead of just 200 days.
Yeah, well, even the nurse, I wouldn't want to stay in the place that they had for 200 days. Like, make it comfortable.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and then another thing that was different is the impetus for sending him back at the end, because in the story, they didn't have any end date to send him back. They were just sort of keeping him indefinitely. And then as the other experiments became more and more important, and eventually they did bring back this medieval peasant, the attention fell away from the Neanderthal child, and they couldn't justify using all the energy to keep him there anymore. So they were starting to talk about when to send him back. But the nurse recognized that you can't keep a child locked up in a room with no contact except for a single nurse, because a huge part of development is socialization. So if they didn't have the child socializing, he wouldn't actually be developing the way a human child is supposed to develop. And so she asked the doctor to get a playmate for Timmy. And he's like, no, that's crazy. We can't bring another Neanderthal here. And she's like, I'm not talking about a Neanderthal, just a regular human child, because he's clearly, a regular human in every way except the way his face looks. And so eventually the doctor decided to let his own son play with the Neanderthal child. And they did this regularly every 2 days for like weeks or months. And then eventually Timmy bit the doctor's son. And it wasn't that his animal side was coming out. It was children bite each other when they get mad.
Yeah.
But the press had immediately labeled Timmy as the ape boy, and that name apparently never went away, and the nurse was really upset by it because he was clearly human, and he was clearly a real human boy. But because the press knew him as an ape boy, the doctor knew this was going to be a huge PR disaster. The ape boy bites his own son, and basically he was sent back very quickly after that, just for damage control. They had just brought back this medieval peasant at exactly the same time as Timmy bit the other boy, because Nurse Fellows wasn't in the room. She was watching the medieval peasant being brought back, right? And so the doctor himself knew that it wasn't Timmy's fault. He knew that his son was the instigator, because his son was calling him Ape Boy. Because it turns out his son was never very nice to him. And so the doctor said, I know that it isn't his fault. I know that my son was in the wrong. But what's going to happen is, as soon as this leaks to the press, they're going to have a field day with this. It's going to be a huge disaster for our company. It's going to look so bad. And he's like, we're just going to send him back right now, and everyone will forget about it, because everyone's going to be looking at the medieval peasant, and nobody's like, the story is out there already, but people are going to forget about it right away, as long as we send him back right away. And so that's why he was sent back early or not early, but he was sent back sort of on short notice in the story. I don't know, I forgot where I was going with that. That was one of the major differences, but I think the story talks a lot more about the ethics of the whole thing, because, so first of all, they didn't necessarily want to get a Neanderthal child, but they wanted to get something big for their first thing, because they had like 10 years of development and tons. They said literally, like, we scrounged and stole literally whatever funding we could get. Like, they transferred funding illegally from other projects to get this thing up and running. And so they said, we need something big, but they couldn't get a medieval peasant at first, because they had a limit on how recently they could look at. He used the example of, like, you can touch your shoulder with your finger, but you can't touch your elbow, so it's too close, and they didn't have the technology to get something that close yet. So they had to get something big, which is why they opted for a Neanderthal, because a rock wouldn't be interesting. Arguably, a lot of different animals they could get wouldn't be interesting. I don't know why they didn't go for a dinosaur, because in the book they did have a dinosaur later. A small one, a chicken-sized one, they said. I guess a chicken-sized dinosaur is not interesting either, and a large dinosaur would have been too dangerous. So it makes sense to get a Neanderthal. It makes sense to me in the book. That's a pretty big thing. It would be a big splash in the media, right?
Yeah, and I guess, a chicken is a chicken-sized dinosaur.
That's true. I thought it was interesting in 1958 that Edith recognized that the dinosaur looked a lot like a chicken. She described it in her head as being like a scaly chicken, and he's like, "That's our dinosaur," right? So it's interesting that even then, science was recognizing the relationship.
I mean, it goes back really early. I mean, Huxley, at the time of Darwin, T.H. Huxley, he was big on the connection between birds and dinosaurs, and then of course Archaeopteryx turns up, and there you go.
Yeah, so anyway, apart from a child, which obviously is unethical, they did explain why they opted for a Neanderthal, and of course they had to get a lock onto somebody. They couldn't really pick and choose. They said it was like I think they described it as like picking up a needle in a haystack or something. You can find one, but if you're looking for a specific needle when you have like 1,000 needles in a haystack, you're never going to find the same needle twice. So they got a lock onto this Neanderthal. It turned out it was a child. They didn't necessarily want a child, but they were kind of lucky, they said, because an adult Neanderthal might be aggressive as well. So, but then like the ethics of keeping it in the lab for so long is a sort of a different question as well, right? Like they were in the film, it's a little more, it's a little less subtle. That the scientist is very cold and not interested, and he's looking for a nurse who is going to be detached, and that's the whole point of hiring her. And it turns out that even though she prides herself on being able to be detached, she makes an emotional connection. I think there's a lot more nuance, and you see a lot more of the doctor's emotional side coming out. Of course, they spend 4 years together as well. Yeah, I'm starting to ramble. I forgot what I was talking about at this point.
I just think it's also sad that she didn't have that much time to prepare because she didn't even have a jacket on. So she's going into places in Europe with just
she didn't even have her
scrubs.
Didn't even have her cravat. It's the last scene is of her cravat outside of the stasis field.
Yeah.
And what are you going to do in the Pleistocene without your cravat?
Yeah. Like, hopefully they get there and there's a tribe that doesn't just kill her right away. Or she's going to have to figure out how to make fire in a damp, cold, Ice Age Europe.
Yeah.
Pretty quickly. And hunt down large animals and make herself a coat.
Well, in the novelization, they have a much happier ending because the novelization has a whole parallel storyline back in the prehistoric time with the Neanderthal group where the child came from, and also a Cro-Magnon group who are in conflict with each other. And then at the end, when she goes back with it, she is basically seen as a god who has returned with the missing child. But because she is a modern human and she's returned basically as the mother to this Neanderthal child, she sort of brings the two groups together and eases the conflict between them.
Oh, so it does end happily in the book. Good. That'd be quite cool.
Spoilers for the book that none of us have read.
Yes. That'd be quite cool if you're, living life here. I'm sure her life was good. When they were saying she had no friends or family or attachments, she probably had a roommate that she lived in a one-bedroom apartment with, right? And was close to. But if not, then you just, you meet this child, you fall in love, you go back in time, and now you're a god. Like, it's pretty sweet.
Yeah, quite a good turnabout.
Mm-hmm.
Should we talk about the 70s facial hair? Or not?
It's coming back.
Yeah, the Dr. Hoskins beard was something.
Mm-hmm.
It was kind of like a beard, but then with a moustache stuck on top.
Mm-hmm.
So the moustache was really prominent.
Yeah, the picture of him with the orange turtleneck was just so like could just be a poster for the time
for
period.
Who? Oh, for the time period. Yeah, I mean, definitely in the short story and also in the film. It kind of expects us to be far more excited about getting a medieval peasant back than a Neanderthal, which obviously we're not the kind of people that would be like that. But I don't know if many, everyday folk with no interest in archaeology would be like that either. I mean, you have essentially a modern day person who maybe speaks, natively Middle English or whichever, medieval language, depending on where he comes from, the version of it. Versus, a non-human hominid species. I think that maybe we've just been lucky to be living in a time period when kind of Neanderthal studies are big news, but I can't imagine anyone thinking that a medieval peasant would be more interesting than a Neanderthal.
What kind of questions are they going to ask the medieval peasant?
Yeah. How many times a year do you have a bath?
Yeah.
What is the price of grain?
Yesterday. Yeah.
And what's a medieval peasant really going to know that we don't know today? I mean, the education of an average person, they're going to probably live within a few miles of their home their entire life. They're not really going to know anything,
No. And their thoughts and feelings and opinions, that would be interesting, but not more so than a Neanderthal.
I think the investors must be medievalists rather than Paleolithic people.
Well, it's a pretty short film, so it might be a pretty short episode.
Well, we've done pretty
Anything
well.
else to say?
Yeah.
Almost
I think
going
we've
on
talked
an
quite
hour.
a bit.
I don't think there's much more to say. It was definitely worth the watch, and sounds like it's worth a read. I'll read it now. Should I read the short story and the novel?
I haven't read the novel.
Just read the short story. I mean, if you get yourself a kind of collection of Isaac Asimov that has it in it, then he's a really good writer. If you like fairly hard sci-fi, then I mean,
I don't.
Yeah, he's left a kind of fairly big, for a science fiction writer, he's left a fairly big mark on culture with things like the 3 Laws of Robotics and other kind of stuff.
The anthology that I read this in is an anthology of stories about children edited by Isaac Asimov, and he's got this story at the end of it, and he's got this sort of preface to the story where he basically says, like, it's a pretty arrogant thing to add your own story into the anthology you're editing, but I think the story is so good, I'm going to do it anyway.
That doesn't really diminish the charges of arrogance, does it?
No. But it's only annoying if it was a really bad story, right? And he just kept trying to push it everywhere, but it's not. So you can recognize your own game. It's fine.
If you've been enjoying Screens of the Stone Age, get in touch with us. Follow us on Twitter at SOTSA_podcast and on Facebook at SOTSA podcast, or send us an email to screensofthestoneage@gmail.com. Screens of the Stone Age is supported by the Paleoanthropological Society of Canada. Find out more at pasc-scpa.ca.